In the glittering halls of a London auction house, a masterpiece, the Crimson Veil, sparks a deadly game of greed and vengeance. When a ruthless bidder collapses, poisoned, during a fierce battle for the painting, the elegant Miss Jane Marple steps into the shadows of suspicion. Was it the ambitious auctioneer hiding secrets in his ledger, the haunted artist guarding a tragic past, or the vengeful widow whose hatred runs deeper than art? With her keen eye and quiet wisdom, Miss Marple unravels a web of motives, leading to a chilling revelation where beauty conceals a murderous heart. Chapter 1. The Gilded Gavel. The auction room of Haverford & Sons was a spectacle of opulence, its high ceilings adorned with glittering chandeliers that cast a soft, golden glow over the assembled crowd. Crimson velvet curtains framed tall windows, and the walls were lined with paintings, each a silent contender for the fortunes of the elite. Miss Jane Marple sat unobtrusively in the back row, her small, neat figure almost lost among the plush chairs. Her hands busy with a skein of pale blue wool and a pair of knitting needles, moved with a rhythm that belied the keen observation in her eyes. She had no particular interest in art, but her nephew, Raymond West, had insisted she attend this evening's auction, where a rare masterpiece, the Crimson Veil, was to be sold. "It's a cultural event, Aunt Jane," he had said with his usual enthusiasm. "You'll find it fascinating." Miss Marple, however, found the people far more intriguing than the paintings, and tonight's gathering promised a rich study in human nature. The room hummed with anticipation, a low murmur of voices rising like a tide. Wealthy collectors, society matrons, and sharp-eyed dealers filled the seats, their postures a mix of calculated poise and restless excitement. At the front, behind a polished mahogany podium, stood Mr. Percival Haverford, the auctioneer. He was a man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his mustache waxed to a precise curl. His voice, smooth and commanding, carried the cadence of a born showman as he introduced the evening's lots with theatrical flourish. Miss Marple noted the way. His eyes darted across the room, assessing bidders with the precision of a hawk. Among the crowd, one figure drew particular attention: Sir Reginald Thorne, a portly industrialist, whose wealth was matched only by his determination to acquire what he desired. He sat in the front row, his broad frame spilling over the edges of his chair, a glass of champagne held loosely in one hand. His florid face, flushed with confidence, betrayed no doubt that he would claim the Crimson Veil. Miss Marple observed the faint smirk on his lips as he surveyed his rivals, a king certain of his throne. Nearby, the artist himself, Julian Voss, cut a starkly different figure. Lean and angular, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire, he stood apart from the crowd, his gaze fixed on the draped canvas that concealed his masterpiece. There was something unsettling about him, Miss Marple thought. A man who seemed to carry the weight of his own genius like a burden. He barely acknowledged the whispers of admiration around him, his expression one of detachment, as if the auction were a necessary evil rather than a triumph. In the third row, Mrs. Lavinia Drake sat with the elegance of a woman accustomed to command. A widow of considerable means, her black silk gown and diamond brooch spoke of wealth, but her eyes, sharp and unyielding, told a story of resolve. Miss Marple had overheard her name earlier, mentioned in hushed tones as a formidable rival to Sir Reginald. The two had clashed at previous auctions, their rivalry a matter of public fascination. Tonight, Mrs. Drake's gaze was fixed on Sir Reginald, and there was no mistaking the cold intensity behind it. As the bidding for lesser lots began, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind cataloging every detail. She noticed the way Sir Reginald's fingers drummed impatiently on his armrest, the slight tremor in Mrs. Drake's hand as she raised her paddle, and the fleeting glance Voss cast toward the auctioneer, as if sharing a private understanding. The air grew thick with anticipation when Haverford announced the Crimson Veil. The canvas was unveiled with a dramatic flourish, revealing a figure draped in scarlet, its face obscured in shadow, the brushstrokes alive with a haunting intensity. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The bidding commenced with fervor. Sir Reginald's voice boomed with each raise, his bids swift and uncompromising. Mrs. Drake countered with measured precision, her lips pressed into a thin line. The numbers climbed dizzyingly, 10,000, 20, 50. Miss Marple watched, her thoughts drifting to a village auction years ago in St. Mary Mead, where a disputed antique had sparked a feud that ended in bitter words. Here, the stakes were higher, the passions sharper. Then, without warning, the rhythm of the auction shattered. Sir Reginald, mid-bid, let out a strangled gasp. His champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. He clutched his chest, his face contorting in agony, and collapsed forward, his bulk slumped across the chair. A woman screamed. The crowd surged to its feet, voices clashing in a cacophony of shock and confusion. Haverford's gavel fell silent, his composure fraying as he called for a doctor. Voss remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the fallen man. Mrs. Drake's hand tightened on her evening bag, her face unreadable. Miss Marple sat still, her knitting needles paused. She had seen the moment of Sir Reginald's collapse with perfect clarity, the unnatural jerk of his head, the sudden pallor that drained his ruddy cheeks. It was not a heart attack, she thought, though others might assume so. Her mind, trained by years of observing the quiet malice of village life, whispered a single word: poison. She tucked her knitting into her bag and leaned forward, her eyes scanning the room for the smallest clue. A gesture, a glance, a misstep that might betray the hand behind the deed. Chapter 2. The Fallen Bidder. The auction room of Haverford and Sons, moments ago a stage of glittering anticipation, had transformed into a scene of pandemonium. The crystal chandeliers still cast their warm glow, but the light now seemed harsh, illuminating the chaos below with unforgiving clarity. Sir Reginald Thorne lay crumpled across his chair in the front row, his florid face now ashen, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The shattered remnants of his champagne glass glittered on the floor, a stark contrast to the crimson velvet carpet. The crowd, a mix of society's elite and sharp-eyed collectors, surged forward, their voices a cacophony of gasps, cries, and urgent whispers. Some called for a doctor, others for the police, while a few retreated to the edges of the room, as if distance could shield them from the horror. Miss Jane Marple remained seated in the back row, her small, neat figure a still point amid the tumult. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap, her hands folded calmly, but her eyes, sharp and bright as a bird's, missed nothing. She had seen death before, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead and beyond, and she recognized its signature. Sir Reginald's collapse had been too sudden, too violent for a natural cause. The way his hand had clutched at his throat, the unnatural convulsion of his limbs, suggested something far more sinister. Poison, she thought, though she kept the word locked behind her gentle smile. It was a suspicion born of instinct, honed by years of observing the darker currents beneath human politeness. Mr. Percival Haverford, the auctioneer, stood frozen at his podium, his polished composure unraveling. His mustache twitched as he barked orders to the staff, his voice straining to maintain authority. "Clear the room, please. Make way for the doctor," he called, though his eyes darted nervously, as if seeking an escape from the scene. Julian Voss, the artist whose masterpiece, The Crimson Veil, had been the evening's centerpiece, remained near the draped canvas, his gaunt frame rigid. His dark eyes flickered toward Sir Reginald's body, but there was no trace of shock, only a strange, detached curiosity, as if he were studying a subject for his next painting. Mrs. Lavinia Drake, seated just behind the fallen bidder, had risen to her feet, her black silk gown rustling softly. Her face was a mask of composure, but Miss Marple noted the tightness of her grip on her evening bag, the faint tremor in her fingers. The widow's rivalry with Sir Reginald was no secret, and tonight's events had cast her in a sharp, unflattering light. A doctor, one Dr. Hargreaves, who had been among the guests, pushed through the crowd. He was a portly man with a bristling beard, his manner brisk but shaken. Kneeling beside Sir Reginald, he checked for a pulse, his fingers pressing against the man's wrist and then his neck. The room fell silent, save for the rustle of silk and the occasional stifled sob. After a moment, "Doctor." Hargreaves stood, his face grim. "He's gone," he announced. "I'm afraid it looks like a heart attack. There's nothing more to be done." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of relief and skepticism. A heart attack was tidy, explicable, a tragedy that required no further questions. But Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She had seen heart attacks before. Old Mr. Enderby in St. Mary Mead, collapsing after a heated parish meeting. And this was different. Sir Reginald's eyes had bulged in a way that spoke of agony, not mere exhaustion. His fingers had clawed at his throat as if fighting an invisible noose. She glanced at the shattered glass again, its contents seeping into the carpet. Champagne did not spill so darkly, she thought, unless tainted by something else. The police arrived swiftly, led by Inspector Craddock, a man Miss Marple knew from previous encounters. He was young for his rank, with a sharp jaw and a no-nonsense air, though he had learned to respect the unassuming spinster's insight. His officers cordoned off the front row, ushering the crowd back with polite but firm commands. Craddock knelt beside the body, his eyes scanning the scene with practiced efficiency. He noted the glass, the spilled liquid, and the faint chemical smell that lingered in the air. "We'll need a coroner," he said quietly to a constable, then turned to address the room. "Nobody leaves until we've taken statements. I'll need to speak with those closest to Sir Reginald during the auction." Miss Marple watched as Craddock approached Percival Haverford first. The auctioneer, still at his podium, dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief, his earlier charm replaced by a nervous fidget. "I saw nothing unusual, Inspector," he said, his voice a touch too loud. Sir Reginald was bidding fiercely, as always. He was in high spirits, raising the stakes for the Crimson Veil. Then he simply collapsed. Haverford's eyes flicked toward the crowd, as if seeking an ally, but found none. Miss Marple noted the way. His hands twisted the handkerchief, betraying a fear that went beyond the shock of a public death. Craddock moved next to Julian Voss, who had not stirred from his spot near the painting. The artist's voice was low, almost monotone, as he answered. "I was watching the bidding, Inspector, but my focus was on my work. Sir Reginald was a patron, nothing more. His death is unfortunate." There was a pause, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, or resentment, in Voss's eyes. He had been near the front when the auction began, close enough to the refreshment table where Sir Reginald's glass had been filled. She filed the detail away, her mind already tracing the threads of possibility. Mrs. Lavinia Drake was questioned last, her posture regal despite the circumstances. "I was seated behind Sir Reginald," she said, her voice cool and measured. "We were competitors, as everyone knows, but I had no reason to wish him harm. I saw him take a sip of champagne just before he collapsed, that's all." Her eyes met Craddock's without flinching, but Miss Marple noticed the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers lingered on the clasp of her bag. Mrs. Drake was a woman who knew how to guard her secrets, and Miss Marple suspected those secrets ran deep. As the police continued their work, Miss Marple slipped into the background, her presence overlooked by most. She preferred it that way. It allowed her to observe without interference. She recalled a conversation she had overheard before. The auction began, as she lingered near the refreshment table, feigning interest in a plate of canapes. Sir Reginald, his voice booming with self-assurance, had been speaking to a fellow bidder. "The crimson veil is mine," he had declared, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "No one else will have it, not even that vengeful widow." Mrs. Drake, standing nearby, had turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. "You think everything can be bought, Sir Reginald," she had replied, her voice low but venomous. "One day you'll learn otherwise." The exchange had been brief, but it carried the weight of old wounds, and Miss Marple knew such wounds could fester into something deadly. She also remembered a small detail from the auction's opening moments. A young waiter, nervous and gangly, had served Sir Reginald's champagne with a trembling hand. When the glass shattered, that same waiter had hesitated before clearing it away, his eyes darting toward Mrs. Drake. It was a fleeting moment, easily dismissed, but Miss Marple had learned never to dismiss the small things. In St. Mary Mead, it was often the smallest slip, a misplaced word, a nervous glance, that unraveled the tightest knot of deceit. As the crowd was gradually dismissed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the room. The auction house, with its gilded walls and polished floors, was a world of wealth and ambition, but it was no different from her village in its essentials. People, she thought, were the same everywhere, driven by pride, greed, or vengeance, their secrets hidden behind smiles and civility. She approached Inspector Craddock, who greeted her with a respectful nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "I suppose you've already formed a theory or two." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "Oh, Inspector, I'm just an old woman who notices things. But I do wonder about that champagne glass. And perhaps you might look into Sir Reginald's dealings with Mrs. Drake. Old rivalries, you know, can be quite illuminating." Craddock raised an eyebrow, but made a note. He had learned not to underestimate the spinster from St. Mary Mead. As he turned back to his officers, Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and stepped into the cool night air. The streets of London were quiet, the city's pulse subdued by the late hour. She thought of the crimson veil, its scarlet figure looming in her mind like a warning. The painting was at the heart of this tragedy. She was certain, but whether it was the motive or merely the catalyst, she could not yet say. Her thoughts drifted to a long-ago incident in her village when a local squire had died suddenly after a heated argument over a piece of land. The coroner had called it apoplexy, but Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, had uncovered a truth far darker. A dose of arsenic slipped into a glass of port. The culprit had been a tenant, overlooked by all, whose grudge had simmered for years. She wondered if Sir Reginald's death followed a similar pattern, a grudge nurtured in silence, a moment seized in the chaos of the auction. As she made her way to her nephew's flat, where she was staying, Miss Marple resolved to visit the auction house again. There were questions to be asked, details to be sifted, and she knew that somewhere in the tangle of motives, Haverford's ambition, Voss's pride, Mrs. Drake's vengeance, lay the truth. She would tread carefully, as always, letting others underestimate her while she pieced together the puzzle. For now, she would rest, but her mind would not. The fallen bidder, she thought, deserved justice, and Miss Jane Marple was determined to see it done. Chapter 3. The Artist's Secret. The morning after the auction, Miss Jane Marple stepped out into the crisp London air, her black handbag tucked neatly under her arm. The city was alive with the clatter of trams and the distant hum of motor cars, but her thoughts were fixed on the events of the previous evening. Sir Reginald Thorne's death had cast a shadow over Haverford and Sons, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, sensed that the truth lay buried in the motives of those closest to the tragedy. She had decided to visit Julian Voss, the artist behind the Crimson Veil, whose strange detachment at the auction had piqued her curiosity. In St. Mary Mead, she had known men like Voss, solitary, guarded, their secrets hidden behind a mask of indifference, and she suspected he held a piece of the puzzle. Voss's studio was tucked away in a narrow street in Chelsea, a ramshackle building that seemed to lean under the weight of its own history. Miss Marple climbed the creaking stairs to the attic, her steps slow but deliberate. The door was ajar, and a faint smell of oil paint and turpentine greeted her before she even knocked. She rapped gently, her knuckles barely disturbing the silence, and a voice, low and distracted, called, "Come in." Inside, the studio was a chaos of creativity. Canvases, some half-finished, others abandoned, leaned against the walls. Tubes of paint and brushes littered a scarred wooden table, and a single skylight cast a pale, unforgiving light over the scene. Julian Voss stood before an easel, his thin frame hunched, his dark hair falling into his eyes. He was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, but his face carried the weariness of an older man. His hands, stained with pigment, moved restlessly, as if they could not bear to be still. "Good morning, Mr. Voss," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear. "I hope I'm not intruding. I was at the auction last night, and I so admired your painting. I thought I might learn more about it." Voss turned, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if assessing whether she was a genuine admirer or merely a busybody. "You're kind to say so," he said, his tone guarded. "But I'm afraid there's little to tell. The Crimson Veil is just a painting, and now it's at the center of all this." He gestured vaguely, as if the death of Sir Reginald were an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. Miss Marple smiled, settling herself on a rickety chair without waiting for an invitation. "Oh, I'm sure it's more than just a painting," she said, her eyes twinkling with gentle curiosity. "It has such intensity. I imagine it must come from somewhere deep within you." She paused, watching his reaction. Voss's hands twitched, and he turned back to his easel, picking up a brush as if to dismiss her. "It's work," he said curtly. "I paint what I feel, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, undeterred. She glanced around the studio, her gaze lingering on a small table cluttered with bottles and jars. Among them was a vial of turpentine, its label faded and peeling, the glass smudged with fingerprints. It was an ordinary item in an artist's studio, yet something about it caught her attention. The way it was placed slightly apart, as if handled recently and with care. She made a mental note, recalling that certain poisons could be concealed in such a container, their sharp scent masked by the turpentine's bite. "You must have known Sir Reginald well," she ventured, her tone light as if making idle conversation. "He seemed so determined to have your painting. Quite a forceful man, wasn't he?" Voss's brush paused mid-stroke, and for a moment his shoulders stiffened. "He was a collector," he said, his voice low. "He wanted what I created, but he didn't understand it. He thought he could own it, like a piece of furniture." There was a bitter edge to his words, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of resentment in his eyes. "He even asked me to paint another crimson veil, as if I could just replicate it, as if art were a factory product." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of innocent surprise. "How extraordinary," she said. "I suppose he didn't realize how personal such a work must be. It must have been quite upsetting." Voss set down his brush, his hands clenching briefly. "Upsetting," he repeated, almost to himself. "Yes, you could say that. He didn't care about the painting's soul. He only cared about its price." He turned to face her fully now, his dark eyes searching her face. "Why are you here, Miss Marple?" she supplied, her smile unwavering. "Oh, I'm just an old woman with a fondness for beautiful things, and I couldn't help but notice how you stood apart last night, as if the auction were distasteful to you." Voss's expression darkened, but he didn't deny it. "I paint for myself," he said, "not for men like Sir Reginald, who wave their money like a weapon. But I had no choice. The auction house insisted, and I needed the funds." He hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more, then added, "I was near the podium all evening, watching the bids." I saw nothing of what happened to him. Miss Marple nodded, her face serene, but her mind was racing. Voss's alibi was convenient, perhaps too convenient. The podium was not far from the refreshment table where Sir Reginald's champagne had been poured, and an artist, accustomed to precision, might easily slip something into a glass unnoticed. Yet his resentment seemed genuine, rooted in pride rather than malice. She thought of a young painter in St. Mary Mead, a shy boy who had once destroyed his own work rather than sell it to a man he despised. Voss, she sensed, was cut from similar cloth, but his desperation for funds suggested a vulnerability that Sir Reginald might have exploited. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've been most kind, Mr. Voss," she said. "I shan't take up more of your time, but I do hope the Crimson Veil finds a home that appreciates it." She paused at the door, glancing back at the turpentine vial. "Oh, and do be careful with your materials. I've heard some chemicals can be quite dangerous if mishandled." Voss's eyes flickered, but he said nothing, merely nodding as she left. As Miss Marple descended the stairs, her thoughts turned to the painting itself. The Crimson Veil was more than a work of art. It was a symbol of something deeper, something that had driven Sir Reginald to his death. She recalled its haunting image, the scarlet figure, its face obscured, as if hiding a secret. Was it merely a coincidence that Voss's own demeanor seemed so guarded, so shadowed? Back on the street, she hailed a cab to return to her nephew's flat, her mind sifting through the morning's discoveries. Voss's resentment of Sir Reginald was clear, but was it enough to kill? And that vial, ordinary yet out of place, nagged at her. In St. Mary Mead, she had once solved a poisoning by noticing a misplaced bottle of weed killer in a gardener's shed. The smallest details, she knew, could unravel the tightest lies. As the cab rattled through London, Miss Marple resolved to speak with Inspector Craddock again. She would suggest he look into Voss's financial situation and any private dealings with Sir Reginald. Artists, she knew, were often proud, but pride could curdle into desperation, and desperation into something far darker. For now, she would keep her suspicions to herself, letting the threads of the mystery weave together in her mind, as delicate and intricate as the lace she knitted on quiet evenings. Chapter 4. The Auctioneer's Ledger. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of London as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to Haverford and Sons. The auction house, so resplendent under the chandeliers the previous evening, looked almost somber in the daylight, its grand facade muted by the gray sky. Miss Marple's black umbrella bobbed above her as she walked, her steps measured but purposeful. Sir Reginald Thorne's death had stirred something in her, a quiet certainty that the truth lay not in the obvious drama of the auction, but in the small, overlooked details that others dismissed. She had decided to speak with Mr. Percival Haverford, the auctioneer, whose nervous demeanor last night suggested more than mere shock at a public tragedy. In St. Mary Mead, she had known men like Haverford, polished, ambitious, but prone to crumbling under pressure, and she suspected he held a key to the mystery, whether he knew it or not. Inside, the auction house was eerily quiet, the velvet chairs empty, the air heavy with the scent of polish and old wood. A young clerk, his face pale from the previous night's events, led Miss Marple to Haverford's office, a small but opulent room tucked behind the main gallery. The auctioneer was seated at a mahogany desk, his usually impeccable suit slightly rumpled, his mustache less pristine than before. Papers were scattered before him, and he was scribbling furiously in a ledger, though he looked up with a start as Miss Marple entered. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" Haverford said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm terribly busy, I'm afraid. This unfortunate business with Sir Reginald has left us in quite a state." His voice was smooth, but there was a tremor beneath it, like a violin string stretched too tight. "Oh, I shan't keep you long, Mr. Haverford," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with a disarming smile. "I only thought, as an admirer of your establishment, I might learn a little about how an auction works. It's all so fascinating. You know, the way you manage such valuable treasures." Haverford's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained wary. "Well, it's a complex business," he began, clearly flattered by her interest. "We catalog the items, verify their provenance, set reserves, and ensure the bidding proceeds smoothly. It requires precision, trust, and, of course, a certain flair." He gestured expansively as if to reclaim his usual charm. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of rapt attention, though her eyes had already caught sight of the ledger on his desk. Its pages were open to the previous night's auction, with neat rows of figures and names. "How meticulous you must be," she said. "I suppose you keep detailed records of every bid, every sale." "Of course," Haverford replied, a touch too quickly. "Our ledgers are impeccable. Every transaction is recorded, down to the last shilling." He reached for the ledger as if to close it, but Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft and curious. "Might I see? Just to understand how it all works. I'm afraid I'm rather ignorant about such things." Her tone was so earnest, so unthreatening, that Haverford hesitated, then slid the ledger toward her with a forced smile. As she scanned the pages, Miss Marple's fingers traced the lines, her mind sharp and focused. The entries for the Crimson Veil were there, detailing the escalating bids between Sir Reginald and Mrs. Lavinia Drake. But one entry caught her eye, a note scribbled in a different hand, indicating a private sale agreement for the Crimson Veil to Sir Reginald, dated 2 days before the auction. The sum was substantial, far below the auction's final bids, but significant nonetheless. Why, she wondered, would Haverford arrange a private sale only to let the painting go to public bidding? It was a discrepancy, small but telling, like a dropped stitch in a carefully knitted scarf. "This is most interesting," she said, her voice mild. "But I'm puzzled, Mr. Haverford. This note about a private sale to Sir Reginald, surely that would have settled the matter before the auction began?" Haverford's face paled, and his mustache twitched. "Oh, that," he said, his voice a shade too casual. "A clerical error, nothing more. Sir Reginald expressed interest, but he insisted on the public auction to drive up the painting's prestige. You know how collectors are, always wanting to make a spectacle." He laughed, but it was a brittle sound, and his hands fidgeted with a pen. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with innocent curiosity. "How extraordinary," she said. "I suppose it must be quite a responsibility, managing such high stakes, and with someone like Sir Reginald, so determined to win. I imagine he could be quite demanding." Haverford's smile faltered. "He was forceful," he admitted. "Always pushing for special arrangements, higher commissions. But that's the business, Miss Marple. We cater to our clients." He leaned back, attempting to regain his composure, but his fingers continued to drum on the desk. Miss Marple closed the ledger gently, her mind racing. The private sale note suggested Haverford had been playing a dangerous game, perhaps inflating the auction stakes to secure a larger commission or to appease Sir Reginald's ego. But if the sale had been agreed upon, why risk the public bidding? And could that risk have driven someone, Haverford or another, to ensure Sir Reginald never claimed his prize? She thought of a village auctioneer in St. Mary Mead, a man who had once falsified bids to pocket extra profits, only to be undone by a sharp-eyed neighbor who noticed an odd entry in his books. Haverford, she suspected, was not above similar tricks, but murder? That was another matter. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Haverford," she said. "I do admire your professionalism, especially under such trying circumstances. I suppose the police will want to see these ledgers, won't they?" Haverford's eyes widened, and he stood abruptly, knocking a pen to the floor. "The police? Oh, I'm sure that won't be necessary. It's all quite straightforward, I assure you." His voice was strained, and Miss Marple noted the beads of sweat on his brow. "Oh, I'm sure it is," she said, her smile serene. "But they do like to be thorough, don't they? Good day, Mr. Haverford." She left the office, her steps light, but her mind heavy with suspicion. The ledger's discrepancy was a thread, delicate but strong, and she would tug at it until the truth unraveled. Outside, she paused to adjust her hat, her thoughts turning to the other players in this drama. Julian Voss's resentment, Mrs. Drake's cold fury, and now Haverford's nervous secrecy. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but none yet fit perfectly. She recalled the champagne glass, its dark stain spreading across the carpet, and wondered if Haverford, with his access to the auction's arrangements, could have tampered with it. Or perhaps he had been complicit, turning a blind eye to another's actions for the sake of profit. In St. Mary Mead, she had once uncovered a theft by noticing a shopkeeper's too eager agreement to a sale. Haverford's eagerness to dismiss the ledger's note felt eerily similar. Miss Marple decided to share her findings with Inspector Craddock, though she would frame them as mere observations. She would suggest he examine Haverford's financial dealings with Sir Reginald, particularly any commissions tied to the Crimson Veil. As she hailed a cab, her thoughts drifted to the painting itself, its scarlet figure looming like a specter. It was more than a work of art, she was certain. It was a catalyst, stirring passions that had led to murder. She settled into the cab, her hands folded neatly, and let her mind weave the threads of motive and opportunity, knowing that somewhere, in the shadows of greed and pride, the truth was waiting to be found. Chapter 5. The Widow's Grudge. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Mrs. Lavinia Drake's drawing room, casting delicate shadows on the polished parquet floor. Miss Jane Marple sat primly on a velvet-upholstered chair, her black handbag resting on her lap, her eyes taking in every detail of the opulent space. The room was a testament to wealth and taste, its walls adorned with paintings that spoke of a collector's discerning eye. Yet there was a conspicuous gap above the marble fireplace, a bare patch where a masterpiece might have hung, perhaps the Crimson Veil. Miss Marple thought, the painting that had sparked such fatal passions. She had received an invitation to tea from Mrs. Drake that morning, delivered by a liveried servant with a note that was polite but edged with calculation. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human behavior, suspected the widow wished to gauge her interest in the auction's tragedy. Mrs. Drake entered with the grace of a woman accustomed to command, her black silk gown whispering as she moved. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and a single diamond brooch glittered at her throat, a stark contrast to the mourning attire that seemed more a statement than a necessity. She was perhaps in her late 40s, her face striking rather than beautiful, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that held a steely resolve. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth but measured, "how kind of you to accept my invitation. I thought we might have a little chat, away from the unpleasantness of last night." "Oh, it's my pleasure, Mrs. Drake," Miss Marple replied, her smile as gentle as ever. "Your home is quite lovely, and such a fine collection of art. I can see why you were so keen on the Crimson Veil." Her tone was light, but her words were chosen with care, probing for a reaction. Mrs. Drake's lips tightened briefly, but she gestured for a maid to pour the tea. The silver service gleamed, and the delicate aroma of Earl Grey filled the air as the maid set out porcelain cups and a plate of scones. "Yes, the painting is remarkable," Mrs. Drake said, settling into a chair opposite Miss Marple. "A pity the auction ended so tragically. Sir Reginald was a formidable opponent. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Drake's face. She noted the widow's careful choice of words, the way her fingers lingered on the handle of her cup, betraying a faint tremor. "He did seem determined," she said, her voice soft. "I understand you and he had quite a rivalry. It must have been trying, competing with such a man." Mrs. Drake's eyes flashed, but she maintained her composure. "Sir Reginald made a sport of outbidding me," she said, her tone cool. "He took pleasure in it, I think, but I'm no stranger to competition. My late husband taught me the value of persistence." She paused, her gaze drifting to the empty space above the fireplace. "That painting would have completed my collection. It was personal." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of sympathetic understanding, though her mind was alert. She recalled the venom in Mrs. Drake's voice at the auction, her sharp retort to Sir Reginald's boasting. There was history here, she thought, deeper than mere rivalry over art. In St. Mary Mead, she had once known a widow who harbored a grudge against a neighbor for a slight long forgotten by others, a grudge that had led to a poisoned jar of preserves. Mrs. Drake, with her wealth and poise, was far removed from village life, but the human heart, Miss Marple knew, was the same everywhere. "I suppose," Miss Marple ventured, setting her cup down, "that Sir Reginald's determination could make enemies. He seemed the sort to press his advantage, shall we say." Mrs. Drake's hand paused midair, her teaspoon glinting in the light. "He was ruthless," she said, her voice low. "Not just in auctions, but in business, in life. He took what he wanted, no matter the cost to others." She met Miss Marple's gaze, her eyes hard. "But I assure you, Miss Marple, I had no hand in his death. I wanted the painting, not his blood." Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "Of course, my dear," she said. "I'm sure no one thinks otherwise, though I did notice you were seated quite close to him at the auction. It must have been dreadful, seeing him collapse so suddenly." Mrs. Drake's composure flickered, her fingers tightening on her cup. "It was shocking," she said. "One moment he was bidding, the next he was gone. I saw him take a sip of his champagne just before. That's all I can tell you." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation, the careful phrasing. Mrs. Drake had been close enough to tamper with Sir Reginald's glass, her evening bag within reach, a bag that might conceal any number of things. The conversation turned to lighter matters, Mrs. Drake's collection, her late husband's passion for art, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She noticed the widow's meticulous attention to detail, the perfectly arranged flowers, the spotless silver, the way her eyes darted to the door whenever a servant passed. It was the precision of a woman who left nothing to chance, and Miss Marple wondered if such precision extended to darker deeds. She thought of the waiter at the auction, his nervous hesitation when clearing Sir Reginald's glass, and wondered if Mrs. Drake had enlisted an accomplice, perhaps unwittingly. As the maid cleared the tea things, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small photograph on the mantelpiece. A younger Mrs. Drake with a man, presumably her late husband, standing before a grand country house. "What a charming picture," she said, rising to examine it. "Your husband, I presume? He must have been very proud of your collection." Mrs. Drake's face softened, but only briefly. "He was," she said. "Henry lived for art. It was his legacy, and I've done my best to honor it." Her voice caught, and Miss Marple sensed a genuine grief, but also something else, a bitterness that lingered like a shadow. She took her leave soon after, thanking Mrs. Drake with her usual courtesy. As she stepped into the street, the cool air sharpened her thoughts. Mrs. Drake's grudge against Sir Reginald was clear, but was it enough to drive her to murder? The widow's wealth gave her means, her proximity at the auction gave her opportunity, and her words hinted at a motive rooted in more than just art. Miss Marple recalled a village scandal where a woman had sabotaged a rival's garden out of spite for a long-ago slight. Mrs. Drake's vendetta, she suspected, ran deeper, perhaps tied to her husband's ruin, as she had later learned from Inspector Craddock's inquiries. As she walked toward the tram stop, Miss Marple's mind turned to the champagne glass, the dark stain on the carpet, and the faint chemical smell she had noted at the auction. Mrs. Drake's composure was formidable, but that tremor in her hand, that guarded glance, suggested a woman who knew more than she admitted. Miss Marple resolved to speak with the waiter, Tommy, whose nervousness had caught her eye. In St. Mary Mead, it was often the overlooked, the maids, the delivery boys, who held the key to a mystery, and she suspected Tommy had seen something, however small, that could unravel the truth. She boarded the tram, her hands folded neatly, her thoughts weaving a delicate web of suspicion. Mrs. Drake was a formidable woman, but even the most careful could make a mistake, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was determined to find it. Chapter 6. A Village Parallel Miss Jane. Marple sat in the cozy sitting room of her nephew Raymond West's London flat, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. The room was modern, with its sleek furniture and bright lamps, but Miss Marple had softened its edges with a crocheted shawl draped over her chair and her knitting bag at her feet. Outside, the city bustled with the clatter of trams and the distant honk of motor cars. But within these walls, her thoughts were quiet, focused, sifting through the tangle of motives and moments surrounding Sir Reginald Thorne's death. The auction at Haverford and Sons, with its glittering surface and dark undercurrents, had stirred memories of her village, St. Mary Mead, where human nature revealed itself in simpler but no less deadly ways. She knew that the key to this mystery lay in understanding the passions that drove its players. Percival Haverford's ambition, Julian Voss's pride, Mrs. Lavinia Drake's vengeance, and she suspected a parallel to a long-ago incident in her village might illuminate the path forward. Miss Marple's mind drifted to a summer years past, when St. Mary Mead had been shaken by the sudden death of a farmer, Mr. Giles, during a heated dispute over a parcel of land. The coroner had called it heart failure, brought on by a fiery argument with a neighbor, but Miss Marple, with her knack for noticing the small things, had doubted the verdict. She had observed Mr. Giles's symptoms, the clutching at his throat, the sudden pallor, and later discovered a trace of poison in his ale, slipped in by a quiet tenant who harbored a grudge over a long-forgotten slight. The tenant, overlooked by all, had been patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Miss Marple wondered if Sir Reginald's death followed a similar pattern, a calculated act disguised as a natural collapse driven by a motive buried in the past. She opened her notebook, a small leather-bound volume, where she jotted her thoughts in a neat, spidery hand. The facts were clear. Sir Reginald had died during the auction, likely poisoned, his champagne glass the probable vehicle. Percival Haverford's ledger had revealed a questionable private sale, suggesting greed or manipulation. Julian Voss's resentment and the suspicious turpentine vial hinted at a man guarding a secret. Mrs. Lavinia Drake's rivalry, coupled with her proximity to the victim, made her a compelling suspect, though her composure was almost too perfect. Yet Miss Marple knew that the truth often lay not in the most obvious suspect, but in the quiet corners, the overlooked details. She sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing as she considered Mrs. Drake. The widow's bitterness had been palpable. During their tea, her words laced with a controlled fury. Miss Marple had since learned, through a discreet letter from Inspector Craddock, that Sir Reginald had ruined Mrs. Drake's late husband, Henry, in a ruthless business takeover years ago. Henry Drake had been a collector, his fortune tied to his art, and Sir Reginald's maneuver had left him destitute, his health broken. Mrs. Drake's pursuit of the Crimson Veil was not just about completing a collection, it was about reclaiming a legacy stolen by Sir Reginald. The motive was strong, but Miss Marple distrusted its clarity. In St. Mary Mead, the most obvious culprit, a jilted lover, a cheated partner, was rarely the true one. She wondered if Mrs. Drake's anger was a mask for a deeper, more personal wound. Her thoughts turned to Haverford, whose nervous fidgeting and questionable ledger suggested a man caught in his own schemes. The private sale note puzzled her. If Sir Reginald had secured the Crimson Veil before the auction, why allow the public bidding? Was Haverford playing both sides, hoping to inflate the price for a larger commission? Or had he been pressured by someone else, perhaps Mrs. Drake, with her wealth and influence? Miss Marple recalled a village shopkeeper who had once juggled two buyers for a single antique, only to be caught when one buyer's wife noticed a forged receipt. Haverford's ledger, she suspected, held more secrets, and she resolved to urge Craddock to examine it further. Julian Voss, too, lingered in her mind. His detachment at the auction, his bitterness toward Sir Reginald's demands, and the turpentine vial in his studio all pointed to a man with something to hide. Yet his motive seemed less clear. Why kill a patron, even one as overbearing as Sir Reginald? Miss Marple thought of the painting itself, the Crimson Veil, with its haunting scarlet figure. Voss had poured his soul into it, and Sir Reginald's insistence on a replica had struck at his pride. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a poet who burned his verses rather than let them be altered for profit. Voss, she sensed, was capable of such passion, but was he capable of murder? She set down her cup, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. The auction was a stage, she thought, where pride, greed, and vengeance had collided. But which had been the fatal spark? She recalled the waiter, Tommy, whose nervous hesitation had caught her eye. He had been near Sir Reginald's glass, close enough to see, or do, something. In her village, it was often the unnoticed, a maid, a delivery boy, who held the key to a mystery. She made a note to find Tommy, perhaps through the auction house staff, and ask him what he had seen. Rising, Miss Marple moved to the window, gazing out at the London street below. The city was vast, its secrets hidden in drawing rooms and studios, but it was no different from St. Mary Mead in its essentials. People, she knew, carried their flaws and desires wherever they went, and those desires could twist into something deadly. She thought of the champagne glass, its dark stain spreading across the carpet, and the faint chemical smell that had lingered in the air. Poison required planning, precision, and a moment of opportunity, qualities that pointed to Mrs. Drake, but also, perhaps, to Haverford's cunning or Voss's desperation. She decided to write to Inspector Craddock, suggesting he investigate Sir Reginald's business dealings further, particularly any ties to Mrs. Drake's late husband. She would phrase it delicately, as a passing thought from an old woman who noticed things. In St. Mary Mead, she had solved many a mystery by nudging the police toward the right questions, and she trusted Craddock to follow her lead. As she penned the letter, her mind returned to the village parallel, the farmer, the poison, the hidden grudge. The truth, she felt, was close, like a pattern emerging in her knitting, but she needed one more thread to tie it together. Sealing the letter, Miss Marple glanced at the clock. It was nearly time for her to meet Raymond for dinner, but her thoughts remained with the auction. The crimson veil was at the heart of it all, she was certain, a symbol of ambition, pride, and loss. She would return to Haverford and Sons, perhaps to speak with Tommy or to examine the painting itself. For now, she tucked her notebook into her bag, her resolve as firm as ever. The mystery of Sir Reginald's death was a puzzle, and Miss Jane Marple was determined to solve it, one quiet observation at a time. Chapter 7. The Poisoned Glass. Miss Jane. Marple sat in the quiet of her nephew's London flat, the soft tick of a mantel clock marking the passage of the late morning. Her knitting lay untouched in its basket, her hands instead occupied with a small notebook where she recorded her thoughts in a precise, spidery hand. The events at Haverford and Sons had taken a darker turn with the arrival of Inspector Craddock's latest report, delivered by a constable just after breakfast. The coroner had confirmed her suspicions. Sir Reginald Thorne had died of cyanide poisoning, the lethal dose likely administered through his champagne during the auction. The news sharpened Miss Marple's focus, for cyanide was no accident. It required intent, opportunity, and a steady hand. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unraveled a poisoning by tracing a single vial of rat poison to a disgruntled housekeeper. Here, the stakes were higher, but the principle remained the same. She closed her notebook and resolved to return to the auction house, where the truth, she felt, lay hidden in the chaos of that fatal night. The streets of London were bustling as Miss Marple's cab wound its way to Haverford and Sons. The auction house stood imposing under a gray sky, its grandeur now tinged with an air of unease. Inside, the staff moved with hushed efficiency, their faces drawn as they prepared for the inevitable inquiries. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and black umbrella, was met with polite deference, but little suspicion. A spinster, they assumed, come to gawk at the scene of tragedy. She requested a moment to view the auction room, claiming a sentimental interest in the evening's events, and the young clerk, too harried to question her, led her inside. The room was much as it had been, though the chairs were now neatly aligned, the velvet carpet cleaned of its dark stain. Miss Marple stood near the spot where Sir Reginald had fallen, her eyes tracing the layout of the space. The refreshment table, where his champagne had been poured, was to the left, a mere 10 feet from the front row. Waiters had moved freely through the crowd, their trays laden with glasses, their presence unremarkable. She recalled the moment of Sir Reginald's collapse, the gasp, the shattered glass, the sudden hush before the chaos. Cyanide, she knew, acted swiftly, often within minutes, which meant the poison had been administered just before his final bid. Her thoughts turned to the 3 figures closest to the crime. Percival Haverford, who had overseen the auction from his podium, Julian Voss, who had lingered near the painting, and Mrs. Lavinia Drake, seated just behind Sir Reginald. Each had opportunity, but the poison required proximity and precision. Haverford, with his access to the auction's arrangements, could have tampered with the glass before it reached Sir Reginald. Voss, with his knowledge of chemicals, might have used his studio's resources to conceal a deadly dose. Mrs. Drake, with her evening bag and calculated composure, was close enough to slip something into the champagne unnoticed. Yet Miss Marple knew that motive, not just opportunity, would unlock the truth. She approached the clerk, a nervous young man named Edward, and inquired about the waiters who had served that night. "Oh, I'm sure they were all very busy," she said, her voice gentle. "But there was one lad, Tommy, I believe, who seemed so attentive. Might I have a word with him? I lost a small brooch that evening, and I thought he might have seen it." Edward hesitated, then nodded, eager to assist. He summoned Tommy, a gangly youth with a freckled face and eyes that darted nervously. Miss Marple led him to a quiet corner, her manner so disarming that he relaxed slightly, though his hands fidgeted with his apron. "Now, Tommy," she said, "you were serving near Sir Reginald, weren't you? Such a dreadful thing to witness. I suppose you saw everything that happened." Tommy swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I didn't see much, ma'am," he said, his voice unsteady. "I was passing out drinks, like always. Sir Reginald took a glass from my tray, and then, well, he just fell over." His eyes flicked toward the front row, as if the memory still haunted him. Miss Marple smiled encouragingly. "Of course, you were busy, but I couldn't help noticing how you hesitated when you cleared his glass, almost as if you were afraid to touch it." Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any telltale sign. Tommy's face reddened, and he shifted his weight. I wasn't afraid, ma'am. It's just the glass was broken, and I didn't want to cut myself. And—" He paused, glancing around as if to ensure no one was listening. "I thought I saw Mrs. Drake lean forward right before he took that last sip. Her hand was near his table, but I couldn't swear to what she did." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, though her mind seized on the detail. Mrs. Drake's proximity was no surprise, but Tommy's observation added weight to her suspicions. "How very observant of you," she said. "And did you notice anyone else near Sir Reginald's glass? Perhaps Mr. Haverford or Mr. Voss?" Tommy shook his head. "Mr. Haverford was at the podium, ma'am, calling the bids. Mr. Voss was over by the painting, not near the table. I don't think they could have done anything." He hesitated, then added, "But the glasses were all on the table before I picked them up. Anyone could have got to them, I suppose." Miss Marple thanked him, slipping a shilling into his hand with a smile. As he scurried off, she stood alone in the auction room, her thoughts racing. Tommy's account narrowed the window of opportunity. The poison had likely been added just before Sir Reginald took his glass, during the brief moment when the waiters were circulating. Mrs. Drake's movement, so subtle yet so deliberate, pointed to her as the most likely culprit. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. In St. Mary Mead, a young maid had once been blamed for a theft because she was seen near the stolen goods, only for Miss Marple to discover the true thief was a trusted butler with a hidden debt. She would need more than Tommy's fleeting glimpse to be certain. She made her way to the refreshment table, now bare, and examined its position relative to the seating. Mrs. Drake's chair had been directly behind Sir Reginald's, close enough for a quick, discreet gesture. Miss Marple pictured the widow, her evening bag in hand, perhaps concealing a small vial or a powder wrapped in tissue. Cyanide, she knew, could be carried in minute quantities, its bitter, almond-like smell easily masked by the champagne's effervescence. She recalled the chemical taint she had noticed at the auction, faint but unmistakable, and wondered if the police had tested the glass's remnants. As she left the auction house, Miss Marple resolved to share Tommy's observation with Inspector Craddock, though she would frame it as a casual remark. She also decided to revisit Julian Voss's studio to press him further about his resentment toward Sir Reginald. The turpentine vial still nagged at her, a small detail, but in her experience, small details were often the key to unraveling a crime. She thought of Haverford, too, whose ledger had hinted at financial games. Could he have been complicit, perhaps turning a blind eye to a poisoned glass for a price? In St. Mary Mead, a grocer had once ignored a tampered jar of jam to avoid a scandal, only to regret it when the truth emerged. Stepping into the street, Miss Marple adjusted her hat against the drizzle. The poisoned glass was the heart of the mystery, she felt, its contents a silent witness to the killer's intent. She would tread carefully, gathering the threads of evidence until they formed a pattern as clear as the lace she knitted. For now, she hailed a cab, her mind already weaving the next steps in her quiet pursuit of justice. Chapter 8. The Crimson Clue. Miss Jane Marple stepped into the hushed grandeur of Haverford and Sons once more, her black umbrella dripping from the persistent London drizzle. The auction house, though still elegant with its polished wood and velvet drapes, carried a faint air of disquiet, as if the walls themselves mourned the tragedy that had unfolded. Her purpose today was singular: to examine the crimson veil, the painting at the heart of Sir Reginald Thorne's fatal obsession. Miss Marple had learned, through a lifetime of unraveling village intrigues, that objects often held secrets as telling as the people who coveted them. In St. Mary Mead, a stolen locket had once revealed a motive for betrayal. Here, she suspected, the painting might offer a clue to murder. The young clerk, Edward, recognized her and hesitated only briefly before granting her request to view the painting, which had been stored in a private viewing room pending the police investigation. "It's a bit irregular, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "But since you were here that night, I suppose it's all right." He led her through a side corridor to a small, dimly lit room where the crimson veil hung alone, its frame stark against the plain wall. Miss Marple stood before the canvas, her hands clasped neatly, her eyes tracing its details. The painting was striking, a figure draped in scarlet, its face obscured in shadow, the brushstrokes vibrant yet haunting, as if capturing a moment of unspoken sorrow. The crimson fabric seemed to pulse with life, its folds suggesting movement, yet the figure's anonymity gave it an eerie stillness. She leaned closer, her nose catching a faint, sharp scent, not the expected tang of oil paint, but something harsher, almost chemical, reminiscent of the turpentine vial in Julian Voss's studio. Could it be, she wondered, that the painting itself had been tampered with, perhaps as a bizarre vehicle for the poison that killed Sir Reginald? The idea seemed fanciful, even to her, but she had learned never to dismiss the improbable. She stepped back, her mind sifting through the facts. The coroner's report had confirmed cyanide in Sir Reginald's system, likely delivered through his champagne. Yet the painting's proximity to the events, its central role in the auction, its hold over the suspects, made her wonder if it held a more subtle clue. In St. Mary Mead, a vicar's wife had once hidden a stolen brooch in the lining of a hymn book, trusting its sanctity to deflect suspicion. Could the crimson veil conceal something similar, perhaps not poison, but a secret that had driven someone to kill? Miss Marple turned to Edward, who hovered nervously nearby. "Such a remarkable work," she said, her voice soft. "I understand Sir Reginald was quite determined to have it. Did he ever speak of it, perhaps when arranging the auction?" Edward shuffled his feet, clearly uneasy. "He was enthusiastic, ma'am. Kept saying it would be the crown of his collection. He even came to see it a few days before, with Mr. Voss. They had words, though I didn't hear much, something about the painting's history." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. "How interesting," she said. "And Mr. Voss? He must be very proud of his creation." Edward nodded. "He's protective of it, ma'am. Didn't like Sir Reginald's attitude, I think. Said something about the painting being personal." He hesitated, then added, "I shouldn't say, but there was a row about a second painting, like Sir Reginald wanted a copy made." Mr. Voss was furious. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind seizing on the detail. She recalled Voss's bitterness in his studio, his disdain for Sir Reginald's demand to replicate the crimson veil. A copy, she thought, would cheapen the original's value, both artistically and financially. A motive for Voss, perhaps, if he feared exposure or loss. But cyanide required more than artistic pride. It required cold calculation. She made a mental note to revisit Voss, to probe deeper into the painting's history. As she left the viewing room, Miss Marple paused by the auction floor, her eyes lingering on the spot where Sir Reginald had fallen. The carpet was pristine now, but she could still picture the shattered glass, the dark stain spreading like a warning. The chemical scent from the painting nagged at her, though she doubted it was cyanide itself, too volatile, too obvious. Perhaps it was a residue from Voss's studio, a careless spill that hinted at his access to dangerous substances. In St. Mary Mead, a gardener's shed had once yielded a bottle of weed killer that solved a poisoning. Here, the turpentine vial in Voss's studio loomed large in her thoughts. She decided to call on Voss again, this time with a more direct approach. The cab ride to Chelsea was brisk, the city's damp streets reflecting her mood, calm but resolute. Voss's studio was as chaotic as before, the air thick with the scent of paint and solvents. He was at his easel, his thin frame hunched, his brush moving with a feverish intensity. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes wary but resigned. "Miss Marple," he said, setting down his brush. "You're persistent, I'll give you that. What brings you back?" "Oh, just a fancy to learn more about your work," she said, her smile disarming. "I saw the crimson veil again today, and I must say it's quite extraordinary. But I heard something curious, that Sir Reginald wanted a copy made. That must have been difficult for you." Voss's face darkened, his hands clenching. "Difficult?" he said, his voice sharp. It was an insult. He thought I could just churn out another, like some factory hand. That painting is my soul, Miss Marple. It's not for copying. He paused, his eyes flickering with something, anger or perhaps fear. He even threatened to expose a secret about it, something from my past. He thought he could control me. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle concern. "A secret?" she said. "How distressing. I suppose it was something personal, tied to the painting's inspiration." Voss hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "It was a private matter," he said finally. "A story from years ago, nothing to do with his death, but he knew how to use it against me." His voice was low, almost a whisper, and Miss Marple sensed he was holding back, guarding a truth he feared to reveal. She nodded, not pressing further, though her mind catalogued his words. A secret tied to the crimson veil, perhaps a scandal, a tragedy, or a hidden flaw in its provenance, could explain Sir Reginald's leverage over Voss. Had the artist, pushed to the edge, resorted to poison to protect his work? Or was the secret a distraction, a shadow cast to obscure another's guilt? She thought of Mrs. Drake, whose grudge against Sir Reginald was rooted in her husband's ruin, and Haverford, whose ledger suggested financial games. The painting, she felt, was the thread that tied them all together. As she left the studio, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the chemical scent. It was a clue, however faint, and she resolved to ask Inspector Craddock to have the painting tested for any unusual substances. In St. Mary Mead, a stained teacup had once revealed a trace of arsenic, overlooked by all but her. Here, the crimson veil might hold a similar truth, hidden in its scarlet folds. She hailed a cab, her mind weaving the strands of evidence: Voss's secret, Mrs. Drake's vengeance, Haverford's greed, into a pattern that was beginning to take shape, though the final piece remained elusive. Chapter 9. The Rival's Confession. The soft glow of gaslight filtered through the heavy curtains of Mrs. Lavinia Drake's drawing room, casting long shadows across the polished furniture. Miss Jane Marple sat once again in the widow's elegant home, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her black handbag resting beside her. The invitation had come unexpectedly that morning, a curt note requesting her presence for a private conversation. Miss Marple, with her keen sense of human nature, suspected Mrs. Drake was not merely seeking company, but testing the waters, perhaps aware that the net of suspicion was tightening. In St. Mary Mead, she had often been summoned by those who wished to deflect or disarm her curiosity, and she approached this meeting with the same quiet vigilance that had unraveled many a village secret. Mrs. Drake entered with her usual poise, her black silk gown rustling softly, her diamond brooch catching the light like a cold star. Yet there was a subtle change in her demeanor, a faint strain around her eyes, a tightness in her smile that betrayed unease. She gestured for the maid to serve tea, and the delicate clink of porcelain filled the silence as the two women settled into their chairs. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Drake began, her voice smooth but deliberate, "I thought it best we speak again. There are rumors circulating, and I wish to set things straight." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle surprise. "Rumors, Mrs. Drake? How distressing. I'm sure you have nothing to fear from idle gossip." Her tone was kind, but her eyes were sharp, watching for the smallest crack in the widow's composure. Mrs. Drake's fingers tightened briefly on her teacup, then relaxed with practiced ease. "It's no secret that Sir Reginald and I were rivals," she said, her voice steady. "He made a game of outbidding me, not just for the crimson veil, but for years. He took pleasure in my losses, Miss Marple. He mocked me, publicly and privately, as if my husband's collection were a trifle to be snatched away." Her eyes flashed with a sudden intensity, and for a moment the mask of civility slipped, revealing a raw, burning anger. Miss Marple nodded, her face sympathetic. "That must have been terribly provoking," she said. "I understand Sir Reginald could be overbearing. I suppose it wasn't just about the paintings, was it?" Mrs. Drake's lips parted, then closed, as if weighing how much to reveal. She set her cup down, the porcelain clinking faintly. "You're perceptive," she said, her voice low. "It wasn't just the paintings. Sir Reginald ruined my husband, Henry, years ago. A business deal, a hostile takeover, they called it. Henry's fortune was tied to his art, his pride in it. When Sir Reginald stripped him of everything, it broke him. He died a year later, a shadow of himself." Her voice trembled, not with tears, but with a fury that seemed to simmer beneath her polished exterior. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was alert. "How dreadful," she said, "to lose so much, and then to face Sir Reginald's taunts at every auction. It must have felt like a wound reopened each time." Mrs. Drake met her gaze, her expression hardening. "It did. But I'm not a murderer, Miss Marple. I fought him with my bids, my money, my resolve. I wanted the crimson veil to honor Henry's memory, to reclaim what was rightfully ours. But I didn't poison him." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "I swear it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her silence inviting more. She had seen such displays of sincerity before. In St. Mary Mead, a vicar's wife, had once sworn her innocence in a theft, only for Miss Marple to uncover a hidden stash of stolen silver. Mrs. Drake's confession felt genuine, but its intensity suggested a woman desperate to be believed. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said at last, "no one could doubt your passion for your husband's legacy. Though I did hear, you'll forgive an old woman's curiosity, that you were seated so close to Sir Reginald that night, and the waiter, Tommy, mentioned seeing you lean toward his table just before he collapsed." Mrs. Drake's composure faltered, her hand jerking slightly, spilling a drop of tea onto the saucer. "Tommy?" she said, her voice sharp. "That boy knows nothing. I leaned forward to adjust my shawl, nothing more. I had no reason to touch his glass." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "The police have been asking questions, haven't they? They think I did it because of Henry." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, almost apologetic. "The police must ask their questions," she said, "but I'm sure they'll find the truth. It's just that cyanide, you know, is such a particular choice. It requires planning and, well, a certain boldness." She watched Mrs. Drake closely, noting the faint flush that crept into her cheeks. "I know nothing of poisons," Mrs. Drake said, her voice regaining its edge. "I'm a collector, not a chemist. If anyone had access to such things, it would be that artist, Voss, with his paints and solvents, or even Haverford, who runs that auction house like his personal fiefdom." She leaned back, her composure restored, but her eyes remained wary. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the widow's deflection. She thought of the chemical scent on the crimson veil, the turpentine vial in Voss's studio, and Haverford's questionable ledger. Mrs. Drake's attempt to shift suspicion was telling, but not damning. Yet the waiter's observation lingered, and Miss Marple recalled another detail from the auction. Mrs. Drake's evening bag, a small beaded affair that had rested on her lap. In St. Mary Mead, a village matron had once hidden a stolen ring in a similar bag, trusting its elegance to deflect notice. Could Mrs. Drake have concealed a dose of cyanide in hers? As the maid cleared the tea things, Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've been most kind, Mrs. Drake," she said. "I do hope this dreadful business is resolved soon. It must be so trying for you." She paused at the door, her eyes catching a small, ornate box on a side table. It was lacquered, with an intricate clasp, the sort that might hold jewelry, or something less innocent. "What a charming box," she said. "A family heirloom, perhaps?" Mrs. Drake's gaze followed hers, and for a moment her face tightened. "A gift from Henry," she said curtly. "It holds nothing of interest." She escorted Miss Marple to the door with a polite but firm farewell. As Miss Marple stepped into the street, the drizzle had given way to a faint mist, veiling the city in a ghostly haze. She walked slowly, her mind turning over Mrs. Drake's words. The widow's confession of her husband's ruin was no surprise. Inspector Craddock's inquiries had already confirmed it, but her fierce denial, coupled with that fleeting moment of panic, suggested a woman teetering on the edge of revelation. The evening bag, the lacquered box, the waiter's glimpse of her leaning forward, all were threads in the tapestry of suspicion, but they did not yet form a complete picture. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead widow who had poisoned a rival's tea over a disputed inheritance, her guilt betrayed by a nervous habit of clutching her reticule. Mrs. Drake's composure was stronger, but that tremor in her hand, that sharp glance at the box, hinted at a secret she was desperate to protect. Miss Marple resolved to share Tommy's observation with Craddock, urging him to examine Mrs. Drake's possessions, particularly that bag. She also considered the other suspects: Voss, with his hidden secret about the painting, and Haverford, whose ledger suggested financial deceit. Each had motive, each had opportunity, but Mrs. Drake's proximity to the poisoned glass made her the most immediate threat. As she hailed a cab, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the crimson veil, its scarlet figure a haunting symbol of the passions that had led to murder. She felt the truth was close, like a melody she could almost hear, but one note was missing. She would continue her quiet inquiries, trusting that the small details, the bag, the box, the chemical scent, would lead her to the killer. For now, she settled into the cab, her hands folded, her mind as sharp as the needles in her knitting bag, ready to unravel the next thread in the mystery of the fatal auction. Chapter 10. The Auctioneer's Game. The late afternoon light filtered through the high windows of Haverford and Sons, casting long, slanted beams across the polished auction-room floor. Miss Jane Marple stood near the entrance, her black umbrella tucked under her arm, her eyes scanning the now familiar space with quiet intensity. The grandeur of the auction house, with its crimson drapes and gleaming chandeliers, seemed diminished in the wake of Sir Reginald Thorne's death, as if the very air held its breath. She had returned with Inspector Craddock, whose presence lent an official weight to her inquiries, though she preferred to work in the shadows, unnoticed by those who might guard their secrets too closely. Her visit to Mrs. Lavinia Drake had sharpened her suspicions, but she knew the truth lay not in one person alone, but in the interplay of motives, greed, pride, vengeance, that had converged on that fatal night. Today, she aimed to press Percival Haverford, the auctioneer, whose nervous demeanor and questionable ledger suggested a man entangled in more than just the business of art. Craddock, with his sharp jaw and brisk manner, had agreed to accompany her after her discreet note about the ledger's discrepancy, a private sale note for the crimson veil that contradicted the public auction. He respected Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unraveling village mysteries, and knew her suggestions often led to breakthroughs. As they entered Haverford's office, a small, opulent room cluttered with ledgers and auction catalogs, the auctioneer rose from his desk, his mustache twitching with unease. His suit, though still tailored, bore faint creases, and his eyes darted between Craddock and Miss Marple like those of a cornered animal. "Inspector, Miss Marple," Haverford said, forcing a smile that faltered under Craddock's steady gaze. "I've already told you everything I know about that dreadful night. I was at the podium, managing the bids. I saw nothing untoward until Sir Reginald collapsed." His voice carried a practiced smoothness, but his hands betrayed him, fidgeting with a silver letter opener. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her expression one of mild curiosity, though her mind was as sharp as ever. "Of course, Mr. Haverford," she said, her voice soft. "You must be terribly busy, tidying up after such a shock. I was just wondering about your ledgers. They're so meticulous. I noticed a curious entry about a private sale to Sir Reginald for the Crimson Veil. It's rather puzzling, don't you think, since the painting went to auction?" Haverford's face paled, and the letter opener slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. "A clerical error," he said quickly, echoing his earlier excuse. "Sir Reginald was keen, but he wanted the spectacle of a public auction. It's not uncommon, you know, to negotiate privately and then let the bidding drive up the prestige." He laughed, a brittle sound that did little to mask his discomfort. Craddock leaned forward, his tone firm but measured. "A clerical error, Mr. Haverford? That's a convenient explanation for a transaction involving thousands of pounds. We've also found a record of a payment from Mrs. Lavinia Drake to you, marked as consulting services, dated just before the auction. Care to explain that?" Haverford's mustache quivered, and he dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief. "Consulting services?" he said, his voice rising. "Mrs. Drake sought my advice on several pieces in our catalog. She's a valued client, Inspector. There's nothing unusual in it." His eyes flicked to Miss Marple, as if seeking an ally, but her gentle smile offered no reprieve. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with innocent inquiry. "How very interesting," she said. "I suppose Mrs. Drake was eager to secure the Crimson Veil, and with Sir Reginald as her rival, she might have needed special assurances, perhaps access to certain arrangements, like the refreshment table." Her tone was light, almost conversational, but the question hung in the air like a blade. Haverford's face flushed, and he stood abruptly, knocking a stack of papers to the floor. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple," he snapped. "I run a reputable business. I had no hand in Sir Reginald's death, and I certainly didn't tamper with his champagne. I was at the podium, in full view of the entire room." His voice cracked, and he sat down heavily, as if the outburst had drained him. Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, who nodded slightly, encouraging him to press further. "Mr. Haverford," Craddock said, "we know cyanide was used, likely in Sir Reginald's glass. You controlled the auction's arrangements, including the staff and refreshments. If someone paid you to look the other way, or to ensure a particular glass reached Sir Reginald, you'd be wise to tell us now." Haverford's hands trembled, and he buried his face in his handkerchief for a moment. "I swear, Inspector, I did no such thing," he said, his voice muffled. "Yes, I took a payment from Mrs. Drake, but it was for advice on bidding strategy, nothing more. And the private sale note, It was Sir Reginald's idea to secure the painting if the bids fell short. I'm not a murderer. I'm just trying to keep this business afloat." His eyes were wide, pleading, but Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow, the way his fingers twisted the handkerchief into knots. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, auctioneer, a man who had inflated bids to pocket extra commissions, only to be undone when a ledger entry betrayed his greed. Haverford's story held a similar ring, plausible but frayed at the edges. The payment from Mrs. Drake was troubling, suggesting she might have bribed him to ensure her access to Sir Reginald, perhaps to his glass. Yet Haverford's panic seemed genuine, the fear of a man caught in a web of his own making, not necessarily a killer. In her village, she had learned that greed often made men complicit, even if they lacked the nerve for murder. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Haverford," she said, her voice kind but firm. "I'm sure the inspector will want to look at those ledgers again, just to be thorough. It's so important to clear up any misunderstandings, don't you think?" Haverford nodded weakly, his shoulders sagging. As Craddock gathered his notes, Miss Marple's mind turned to the other suspects. Mrs. Drake's payment to Haverford strengthened her position as the prime suspect, her motive and opportunity clear. Yet Voss's secret about the crimson veil lingered, as did the chemical scent on the painting and the turpentine vial in his studio. Could Haverford have been a pawn, distracted by his own schemes, while another slipped cyanide into the champagne? She recalled the waiter, Tommy, and his glimpse of Mrs. Drake leaning toward Sir Reginald's table. A small detail, but one that tied her to the poisoned glass. As they left the office, Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his voice low. "You've got a knack for making people squirm, Miss Marple," he said, a hint of a smile in his eyes. "That payment from Mrs. Drake, it's a lead worth following. I'll have my men look into her finances and any connections to Haverford's staff." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who notices things," she said. "But I do think Mrs. Drake's bag might be worth a look. And perhaps Mr. Voss's studio, too. Those chemicals, you know, can be so telling." She paused, her mind drifting to a saint. Mary Mead, grocer, who had taken bribes to overlook spoiled goods, only to be caught when a customer noticed a tampered label. Haverford, she suspected, was similarly entangled, his greed a weakness that someone, perhaps Mrs. Drake, had exploited. As they stepped into the street, the drizzle had returned, cloaking London in a fine mist. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her thoughts weaving together the threads of evidence. Haverford's ledger, Mrs. Drake's payment, Voss's secret, the poisoned glass. The truth was close, she felt, like a pattern in her knitting that was nearly complete. She would urge Craddock to search Mrs. Drake's possessions, particularly that beaded evening bag, and to investigate Haverford's staff for any signs of complicity. For now, she hailed a cab, her mind as sharp as ever, ready to unravel the final strands of the mystery that had turned an auction into a scene of murder. Chapter 11. The Artist's Burden. The narrow streets of Chelsea were slick with evening mist as Miss Jane Marple's cab pulled up to Julian Voss's studio once more. The attic windows glowed faintly, a sign that the artist was at work, his solitary world of paint and canvas undisturbed by the city's clamor. Miss Marple stepped out, her black umbrella shielding her from the drizzle, her mind as focused as ever. The mystery of Sir Reginald Thorne's death had grown sharper with each clue. Percival Haverford's questionable ledger, Mrs. Lavinia Drake's calculated payment, the waiter Tommy's fleeting glimpse. But the artist, with his guarded demeanor and the suspicious turpentine vial, remained an enigma. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once uncovered a thief by noting a gardener's reluctance to discuss his tools. She suspected Voss's reticence hid a similar truth, one tied to the crimson veil and the poison that had ended Sir Reginald's life. She climbed the creaking stairs to the studio, her steps deliberate, her black handbag tucked under her arm. The door was ajar, and the familiar scent of oil paint and turpentine greeted her, now laced with a faint, acrid undertone that quickened her pulse. Voss was at his easel, his thin frame hunched, his brush moving with a restless energy. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes narrowing with a mix of irritation and resignation. "Miss Marple," he said, setting his brush down with a sigh. "You're becoming a regular visitor. I suppose you're still curious about that wretched auction?" Miss Marple smiled, settling onto the same rickety chair as before, her demeanor as unassuming as a village spinster's. "Oh, Mr. Voss, I do apologize for intruding," she said, her voice soft. "But your painting, The Crimson Veil, has quite captured my imagination. I saw it again at Haverford and Sons, and I couldn't help wondering about its inspiration. You mentioned a secret Sir Reginald threatened to expose. It must have been terribly distressing." Voss's hands stilled, and for a moment he seemed to shrink into himself, his gaunt face shadowed by the skylight's dim glow. "Distressing," he echoed, his voice low and bitter. "Sir Reginald was a bully, Miss Marple. He thought he could own me, just as he thought he could own my work. He found out something private, and used it to twist my arm. But it's not what you think. It's not about murder." His eyes met hers, fierce but haunted, as if daring her to probe further. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle concern. "Of course, my dear," she said. "I'm sure it's nothing so sinister. But a secret about a painting as powerful as the Crimson Veil, well, it must be something deeply personal. Perhaps a memory or a story from your past." Her tone was light, but her words were chosen with care, like needles threading through delicate fabric. Voss hesitated, his fingers twitching toward a rag stained with paint. "It was a woman," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Years ago, in Paris. She was my muse, my everything. She died, tragically, suddenly. And the Crimson Veil is her, or what's left of her. Sir Reginald learned of it somehow. He said he'd tell the world she was a fraud, a nobody, that my masterpiece was built on a lie." He laughed, a harsh, broken sound, as if her memory could be reduced to gossip. Miss Marple nodded, her face soft with sympathy, though her mind was racing. A tragedy in Voss's past, tied to the painting, explained his protective fervor, his refusal to replicate it. But it also gave Sir Reginald leverage, a weapon to wield against the artist's pride. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a poet who destroyed his work rather than see it mocked. Voss's passion, she sensed, could have driven him to desperate measures. "How dreadful," she said, "to have such a personal loss threatened like that. It must have made you terribly angry." Voss's eyes flashed, but he shook his head. "Angry, yes, but I didn't kill him," he said. "I was near the painting all evening, not the refreshment table. I had no chance to touch his glass." His voice was firm, but his hands betrayed him, clenching the rag until his knuckles whitened. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the cluttered table, where the turpentine vial still stood, its label faded, its contents faintly clouded. She recalled the chemical scent on the crimson veil, the coroner's confirmation of cyanide, and Tommy's account of the poisoned glass. Cyanide, she knew, could be concealed in a vial like that, its sharp smell masked by turpentine's bite. Voss's studio, with its array of solvents and pigments, was a chemist's playground, and his proximity to the auction's start, before he took his place by the painting, gave him opportunity. Yet his motive seemed less compelling than Mrs. Drake's vengeance or Haverford's greed. A man protecting his art's honor might lash out, but poison required cold calculation, not just passion. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've been very patient, Mr. Voss," she said. "I shan't trouble you further, but I do hope the Crimson Veil finds a home that honors its significance." She paused at the door, glancing back at the vial. "And do be careful with your materials. Some chemicals can be so unpredictable, can't they?" Voss's eyes followed hers, and for a moment his face tightened, as if he sensed her suspicion. "I'm careful," he said curtly, turning back to his easel. "Good evening, Miss Marple." As she descended the stairs, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. Voss's confession about the woman behind the crimson veil added depth to his motive, but it also humanized him, making murder seem less likely. Yet the vial nagged at her, a small detail that refused to fit neatly into the puzzle. In St. Mary Mead, a misplaced bottle of medicine had once led her to a poisoner. Here, the turpentine vial might hold a similar truth. She resolved to urge Inspector Craddock to test it, along with the painting, for any trace of cyanide. Outside, the mist had thickened, cloaking Chelsea in a ghostly veil. Miss Marple walked slowly, her umbrella tapping the pavement, her mind weaving together the threads of evidence. Mrs. Drake's payment to Haverford, Tommy's glimpse of her leaning toward Sir Reginald's table, and now Voss's secret. All pointed to a web of motives, but the poisoned glass remained the key. She thought of Haverford, whose ledger suggested he might have facilitated access to the champagne, perhaps for a price. In her village, a shopkeeper had once turned a blind eye to a tampered package for a bribe. Haverford, she suspected, could have played a similar role. As she hailed a cab, Miss Marple felt the mystery drawing closer to its resolution. The artist's burden, his pride, his pain, had given her a clearer picture, but it also deepened the shadows around Mrs. Drake and Haverford. She would meet with Craddock tomorrow, suggesting a search of Mrs. Drake's evening bag and a closer look at Voss's studio. The truth, she felt, was like a melody she could almost hear, its final notes waiting to be played. For now, she settled into the cab, her hands folded, her mind as sharp as ever, ready to unravel the next thread in the fatal tapestry of the auction. Chapter 12. The Final Bid. The private viewing room at Haverford and Sons was a study in contrasts, the opulence of its crimson drapes and polished wood marred by the somber weight of recent events. Miss Jane Marple stood quietly at the center, her small figure dwarfed by the grandeur, her black handbag clutched in her hands. The room had been chosen for its seclusion, a fitting stage for the final act of the mystery that had begun with Sir Reginald Thorne's collapse. Inspector Craddock had arranged this gathering at her suggestion, inviting the key figures, Percival Haverford, Julian Voss, and Mrs. Lavinia Drake, to hear her deductions. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and sharp mind, had pieced together the threads of motive and opportunity, drawing on parallels from her village of St. Mary Mead, where human nature revealed itself in patterns as clear as her knitting. The suspects entered one by one, their faces a mix of apprehension and defiance. Haverford, his mustache less pristine than usual, fidgeted with his cufflinks, his eyes darting to the door as if hoping for escape. Voss, gaunt and intense, stood near the crimson veil, which hung on the wall, its scarlet figure seeming to watch the proceedings with silent judgment. Mrs. Drake, in her black silk gown, carried herself with regal composure, though her fingers gripped her beaded evening bag with a telltale tightness. Craddock stood by Miss Marple, his notebook open, his expression one of quiet confidence in her ability to unravel the truth. Miss Marple began, her voice soft but clear, carrying the authority of one who had seen through many a deception. "It's a sad business, isn't it, when beauty leads to such tragedy," she said, gesturing toward the painting. "Sir Reginald Thorne died here, in this very room, during the auction of the Crimson Veil. The coroner confirmed cyanide in his champagne, a poison that requires planning and precision. I've been thinking, as I often do, of a case in my village where a farmer was poisoned over a dispute no one thought serious until it was too late. Here, too, the motives seemed small at first: pride, greed, vengeance. But they've woven a deadly pattern." She turned to Haverford, her eyes gentle but piercing. "Mr. Haverford, your ledger showed a private sale to Sir Reginald before the auction, a curious detail for a painting meant for public bidding. You called it a clerical error, but I suspect it was a scheme to secure a commission, perhaps by playing Sir Reginald and Mrs. Drake against each other. Your greed made you a target for suspicion, but I don't believe you had the nerve for murder." Haverford's face flushed, and he stammered a protest, but Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing him. Next, she faced Voss, whose dark eyes met hers with a mix of defiance and unease. "Mr. Voss, your painting is at the heart of this tragedy. You told me of a woman in your past, the inspiration for the Crimson Veil, and how Sir Reginald threatened to expose her memory. Your pride was wounded, and that turpentine vial in your studio raised questions. Cyanide could be hidden in such a container. But your motive, I think, was to protect your art, not to kill. You were near the painting, not the refreshment table, when the poison was administered." Voss's shoulders sagged slightly, relief flickering in his gaze, though he remained silent. Finally, Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Drake, whose composure held like a brittle mask. "Mrs. Drake, you had the strongest motive. Sir Reginald ruined your husband, Henry, stripping him of his fortune and his pride. The Crimson Veil was more than a painting to you. It was a chance to reclaim his legacy, to triumph over the man who mocked you. You were seated behind Sir Reginald, close enough to tamper with his glass. The waiter, Tommy, saw you lean forward just before he took that fatal sip." Mrs. Drake's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp. "I've told you, Miss Marple, I did no such thing. I leaned to adjust my shawl. You have no proof." Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her words were precise. "Proof is a curious thing, Mrs. Drake. In my village, a woman was caught because she hid a stolen ring in her sewing basket. You, I believe, hid something in that evening bag of yours." She paused, letting the words settle, then turned to Craddock. "Inspector, you were kind enough to follow my suggestion and search Mrs. Drake's home. What did you find?" Craddock stepped forward, his voice steady. "We found a jeweler's receipt in Mrs. Drake's study, dated a week before the auction, for a custom-made ring with a hidden compartment. The ring was in her evening bag, and traces of cyanide were detected inside. It's small enough to conceal a lethal dose, easily opened with a flick of the finger." Mrs. Drake's face drained of color, her bag slipping from her hands to the floor. "That's preposterous," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of the evidence undeniable. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but unrelenting. "You knew Sir Reginald's habits, Mrs. Drake. You knew he always sipped his champagne during the bidding, savoring his triumphs. You paid Mr. Haverford for consulting services, ensuring you had access to the refreshment table's arrangements. When the moment came, you leaned forward, opened that clever ring, and slipped the cyanide into his glass. It was swift, precise, and no one noticed, except Tommy, who saw just enough to confirm my suspicions." Mrs. Drake's composure shattered, her hands trembling as she sank into a chair. "He deserved it," she said, her voice breaking. "He took everything, Henry's dreams, our life. I couldn't let him take the painting, too. It was all I had left." Tears streamed down her face, but there was no defiance now, only the weight of her confession. Craddock signaled to a constable, who gently took Mrs. Drake's arm. As she was led away, her head bowed, Miss Marple gazed at the crimson veil. "Such beauty," she murmured, "and such sorrow." She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a single act of vengeance had once torn a family apart, and felt a pang of pity for the widow whose grief had turned to murder. Haverford and Voss stood silent, their own secrets exposed, but their guilt limited to lesser sins. Craddock turned to Miss Marple, a wry smile on his lips. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said. "I'd have missed that ring without your nudge." "Oh, Inspector," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I'm just an old woman who notices things. Shall we go? I've a train to catch back to St. Mary Mead." She picked up her handbag, her knitting needles clicking softly inside, and left the auction house, her work done, the fatal bid finally settled.